really, what I do study is not video art or black culture. What I do study is mythology and media. So that will be my perspective on discussing Warburg and Arthur Jafa. And okay, so there's three little parts in the talk. I will start the first one. It goes throughout the 20th century, the act of montage has been established not only as a central technique for modern art, but also a theoretical practice. Surrealism and Dadaism and other movements in modernist art have constructed a grammar of montage, which was very important, for example, for Lévi-Strauss' formulation of bricolage as a compositional logic of mythical thinking. And then in cinema, Eisenstein and Kuleshov theorized it extensively. And of course, Walter Benjamin's Passagenwerke tried to produce a method of textual montage to deal with modernity. And Benjamin says that carrying the principle of montage into history means assembling large-scale constructions from the smallest components cut in the most precise way in order to achieve in a singular moment the crystal of the total event. That is, Benjamin wanted his dialectical montage to focus on the singular detail, but also to accumulate those details in groups and populations of rhythmic cells in order to achieve a synoptic view of the whole. It's impossible for us to conceive this recent retrieval of the erratic figure of Aby Warburg by authors like Didi Huberman and Philippe-Henri Michaud without this previous path of recognition of montage as a legitimate form of thinking. In Aby Warburg's Atlas Mnemosyne, which was conceived in an inventory of classical imagery, which elicited the apparition of dynamic movement in Renaissance art. They were composed of panels with photographic reproductions of paintings, sculptures, and archaeological objects disposed in various sizes against a black background. Even though it was never completed, it is now largely considered a radical act of reinvention for art history, as well as for the study of mythology. With his Iconologie des Zwischenraums, the iconology of the interval, Warburg wanted to find a way of showing figural movement that was invisible to our usual measurements. And he wanted to capture the specters and gods that were hidden between the images on the noisy trail that's left behind the transmission of artistic signals. So we can find in the Atlas Mnemosyne this bold attempt to reproduce in its own logic of composition of the atlas itself, those ontogenetic processes, those processes of development and growth that he was trying to describe. That is, Warburg tried to assemble a method of critical montage that would carry in its own mnemotechnic configuration the rhythmic charge of polarized historical feeling that is inscribed in material registers of art. Warburg was not only telling us how forms and gestures may survive after they apparently die, but he was also showing us through his own manic method of imagetic composition that the feeling inside the gesture can be completely inverted by history. The atlas is a sequential set of images made to demonstrate how images change in and through time, and also how affect is thus transduced and transformed through different media. What do I mean by transduction, right? Transduction in physiology and electronics is a conversion from one type of energy to another. In the Simondonian sense, Gilbert Simondon, it means also a recursive process of reticular structuration that forms a layer and uses that layer as a basis for the next one. Jaffa and Warburg are both great transducers of movement and affect. But how does Jaffa does that? This is the second part. I use the term poor image in the title, which is of course a reference to Hito Styles' famous essay from 2009. However, shortly after picking this title, it occurred to me that this was maybe not the best way to frame the differences between the two. Because if we can say that Jaffa does work with a poor image, of course, a lot of people highlight the fact that he uses YouTube images and with low resolution. But Aby Warburg himself could also be considered already a sort of historian of the poor image, not only because he was dealing with photographic reproductions, but also because he had the disposition to find resonances in places that were outside the scope of self-respecting art historians at the time, like Arabic astrological almanacs from the 12th century or advertising images from the 20th century. But that is not the biggest difference between Jaffa and Warburg. What I would try to argue is that Jaffa's work offers us a singular vision for how to create alternative affective histories for gestural traditions traditions of gesture, that is, that fall outside the scope and range of traditional circuits of artistic conservation and appreciation. That is, I believe Jaffa's work is not only important for North American Black culture or even only for African American culture. In fact, he offers a prototype for the establishment of alternative visual grammars of collective creativity. For all the imagetic transmission for corpora that fall outside the range of traditional circuits. I already said that sentence, sorry. That is, if Warburg presents us with a speculative vision of how gestures and effects are transmitted and transformed through time in discrete objects preserved in technical stereoized memory, Jaffa attempts to give us a synoptic montage of gesture and effect that is mostly, if not exclusively, manifested by the human body in actual motion. In his brilliant text for a Black visual intonation, as well as in several interviews and lectures, Jaffa has argued that perhaps Black culture in America has exceeded so tremendously in dance and music because these were art forms that could survive the trip in slave ships. The millions of people that came from Africa to the American continent could not bring with them sculptural and architectural practices, but they could not help but bring their own bodies along, their gods and their chants along with them. And with that, they brought thousands of years of gestural and oral memory, which is still currently being transduced in contemporary American culture. So I believe that is this deep bodily memory that Jaffa is trying to decompose and recompose into a contagious zone of affective proximity, which is the John Aconfra's expression for Jaffa's work. To get a little more theory heavy here, to use Bernard Stiegler's term, Aby Warburg gives us an affective history of tertiary retention, whereas Jaffa gives us mostly an affective history of secondary retention, even if, of course, to that end, he uses tertiary retentions of movies and sound recordings. This does not mean that Jaffa is not paying attention to other registers. Like he's quoting extensively from Black cinema, as well as from George Harriman's Crazy Cat, the greatest comic strip of all time, and also a myriad of other discrete artworks. But what I believe really sets his work apart from Warburg, which is this sensitivity to affective transduction that is loose and dispersed throughout a vast vernacular territory. There is this quote by Jaffa himself discussing the work of artist Frida Orupabo, and someone else, a text on Jaffa already remarked that this quote from Jaffa can be seen to also describe his own work. Unfortunately, I forgot who already said that, but it was already said, and it's true. I think that the quote really does describe his own work, and the quote goes, "This is nothing short of a mobile repository, a litany of residua, a voluptuous trail of Black continuity, pyramid schemata as densely inscribed as any book of the dead." I will try to put this quote later on the chat if you couldn't understand it. So he compares this other artist's work to a Book of the Dead, which I think is also can be said of his work. And of course, both the Egyptian and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which did not have those as the original titles, they had the function, or they have the function of serving as a sort of guide for the afterlife. They offer a series of exercises to be repeated in the event of your death. In the case of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a series of spells to be repeated in the event of your death in order to achieve a safe passage to the afterlife. So if we are to think of Jaffa's work as an African-American Book of the Dead, this means not only a guide for the afterlife of gestures and feelings, but also a sort of guide for the living to navigate the endless sea of trauma and ecstasy that is trans-individual memory. And here I'm not only talking about his most famous work, Love is the Message is Death, but also of Kingdom Cometh and Dreams Encoded in Death, as well as his thoughts and formulations that he gives on lectures, which are already, I think, very influential. Unfortunately, I could not find access to either the work Apex or the White Album, which is some of his most best regarded work. But the little snippets that I could find and read of it do seem to contribute to that, although, of course, in other directions, the White Album especially, which is not as focused on, as the name suggests, as Black culture as it is on white representations of Black culture. Anyway, so perhaps the most fruitful way of being inspired by Aby Warburg's vision would not be simply that of obsessing endlessly over his atlas, although of course we can do that by all means, it's endlessly fascinating, but we should also try to conceive of ways of actualizing his vision for other traditions. Perhaps Arthur Jafa's work could inspire us to construct new grammars and new imagetic histories of vernacular forms and of affective transduction. Jaffa was influenced by Ismail Reed, who in his great 1972 novel Mumbo Jumbo has the Egyptian god Thoth to be not only the first grammarian and the first magician, but also the first choreographer. Aby Warburg saw that there were deities disguised as planets in the north, while Arthur Jafa sees that there are deities disguised as dancers in the other north. So for that Native American culture, for Afro-Brazilian culture, I believe there is a lot that can and should be done in this direction. We need new seismographers for the 21st century, like Arthur Jafa, that are attentive to a wide spectrum of movement. We need new combinations of resolutions and sampling frequencies so that both old and new spirits can come to guide and possess us anew. Thanks. That was it.